Aloha, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Queen's Speaking of Health lecture series. Tonight's lecture is called Overcoming Life's Challenges, How to Build Resilience. My name is Lisa Sakia. I'm with Corporate Communications here at the Queen's Health Systems, and on behalf of Queen's, I welcome you all this evening. I want to apologize. I spent this past weekend and these past 2 days building resilience of another sort, physical resilience, trying to beat back a cold. I think I was unsuccessful, unfortunately. So if I have a coughing conniption, I am sucking on a lozenge. I apologize for that in advance. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our main speaker for this evening, Dr. Barry Carlton. I'm going to have him stand quickly right here. Let's give him a warm round of applause. He is a psychiatrist and the chief of psychiatry at the Queen's Medical Center. He is the director of medical education and patient care for the Kekela Adult Inpatient Unit and the Family Treatment Center Inpatient Child and Adolescent Inpatient Unit. He received his medical degree from the SUNY Downstate College of Medicine. He completed his training in psychiatry at the University of Michigan. Since being in Hawaii, he served as the superintendent and clinical director of the Hawaii State Hospital and has attended psychiatric patients at Queen's. He is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Hawaii John A. Burns School of Medicine. Nationally, he serves on the Maintenance of Certification Committee for the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Last year, we honored Dr. Carlton as the 2016 Kekauka Po'okela Outstanding Physician of the Year. He won for Outstanding Community-Based Physician. This award honors Queen's physicians who exemplify high-quality care, professional conduct, and outstanding contributions to the medical field, all while serving with the spirit of aloha. He wanted me to share that he is a widower. He has 2 grown children, and the reason why he is here is what happened in 1990. Both he and his wife had cancer. And you're going to hear about resilience and personal resilience from him this evening. Dr. Barry Carlton.
I'd like to thank you all for attending. I greatly appreciate it, especially those who heard me last year and returned, so that at least it wasn't a total dud. Resilience, as was mentioned, is highly personal. You develop, there are strategies that you can utilize, but they are all basically individual strategies. It's ideas that can be mentioned, but not necessarily something that can be prescripted. So it's not like a medical treatment. So a couple of definitions. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity. Stress is the experience of an adverse circumstance. And stress can result in anger, anxiety, irritability, depression, negative thoughts. And there are a variety of stress reduction techniques. Why it's in the handout is as you face different difficulties and you use stress reduction techniques to manage those difficulties, you're basically building resilience. So resilience is built over time. Anxiety is an unpleasant state of turmoil. And at times, it can be accompanied by nervous behavior, physical complaints, ruminating thoughts, feelings of dread, multiple worries, and at times an overreaction to a situation with muscle tension, fatigue, problems with attention, concentration, difficulty breathing, palpitations. Sounds like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, everything that could possibly go wrong. Anxiety may be appropriate based on the experience, but it can often take on a life of its own, and that then becomes an anxiety disorder. And that's not what we're going to talk about this evening, but anxiety is part of the human condition. We all experience it. And part of building resilience is effectively managing anxiety so it doesn't get the better of you and so that it doesn't build to take on a life of its own. So, resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity, and these adverse events can be trauma, some form of tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It develops in childhood. If you're lucky, it develops by positive parenting. And we're going to kind of hear that at the end. But it is often developed from recurring threats, such as bullying, neglect, physical or sexual abuse, the death of a parent, addiction, or witnessing domestic violence. Again, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Resilience began to be studied actually here in the islands. It's the Kauai family study, which was entitled Journeys from Childhood to Midlife. There were 698 babies born on the island of Kauai in 2001. And the study tracked these children. And there were assessments at 1 year, 2 year, 10, 18, 32, and 40 years. So it is a long-term longitudinal study. At the time of their birth, 129 of them were identified as high risk because of adversities at birth. These included poverty, alcoholism, substance use, or mental illness in the family. 2/3 of the children went on to have difficulties, such as delinquency, unplanned pregnancies, and underemployment. 1/3 did quite well, and their outcome was the same as the more fortunate. They developed into adults with supportive families. They were competent, confident, and caring adults. Their characteristics were active problem solvers. They fought for themselves, utilizing their own strengths, such as an athletic talent, a musical talent, an engaging personality, their intellectual abilities. They sought out friends, teachers, and neighbors, or relatives who cared. Emphasize they sought out. It wasn't necessarily provided. They developed and utilized ambitious but realistic goals, education, the military, creativity, athleticism. They developed the idea, or they had a supportive partner, which I'll get to in a minute, or the meaning of becoming a parent. And they experienced themselves as determined. And an important underlying characteristic is that problems are not in control. They were. So, for example, one example, not from the Kauai study, but from this island, is a young woman who is now graduated from JAPSOM and is a practicing physician. And I interviewed her actually on her admissions interview for the medical school. And she described growing up in the foster system. She had been a victim of both physical and sexual abuse. Both parents were abusing alcohol or substances. Father was in prison. She had no idea where the mother was. And parental rights had been terminated when she and her brother were, I believe, 12 and 5, the older brother. She saw her older brother in the foster family develop into somebody who abuses substances, delinquency. For those of you on the windward side, he spent time at Ko'olau as well as in the detention facility, which used to be here in town and is now far out in Kapolei. And she decided this was not going to be her story. She decided at about when she was 12 that she was not going to be her brother. She was going to go to school, and she was going to be a physician. And she had the intellectual ability to do it, and she succeeded. And for those of you who don't know it, if you're in the foster family, if you're in the foster system, and you continue your education, they will pay for it. So she was able to be educated here in Hawaii and used her abilities and her wish to succeed to turn herself into a successful physician who now actually does do a lot of work with the indigent and foster families. She's one of the people who screens the children for foster care and helps develop care plans for them. Another young woman, another example, is a young woman who grew up in the foster system. Again, parental rights were terminated. And she was, for want of a better word, again, in and out of running away from different foster families, abusing drugs and alcohol. And she was fortunate at the age of 15 to discover, or a foster parent discovered her, who she was able to connect with. She, several years ago, won the Mental Health Association award for the young person. And she described her growing up. She described the role of the foster parent in showing her something different, that she could choose to control the circumstances of her life in a more meaningful way. She graduated from high school. She made use of the foster family to go. She then went to Manoa and finished up with a degree in social work from Manoa. So these are examples of having realistic goals that are attainable, but deciding you're going to be in control and that the problems are not going to control you. Now, the other area of resilience is for adults in adverse circumstances, for example, political prisoners or survivors. What they described is they fight back in their own minds. That is, they're able to divorce themselves somewhat from their current reality, and they create in their own minds fighting back or fighting. I wouldn't call my next statement as an example of that, but it's the idea of managing stress, managing tension, using ideas and fantasies that reduce anxiety. For example, those who know me would know that I'm not really very even-tempered, and I can be quite annoying and very irritable. And actually, I can be quite nasty when I'm angry. So when I begin to feel this way, I plan vacations, which I don't take. And so, again, you can manage adversity and you can manage stress by using techniques in your mind. It doesn't necessarily have to be elaborate. And you can then, each time you manage the problem, you're building resilience. So it's an enduring characteristic, often developed in childhood, but it can be learned and fine-tuned throughout the life cycle. Some advantages that older people have in developing resilience are, well, your brains have developed, you're no longer a child or an adolescent, so you have a better ability to regulate feelings, unless you lose it. You have perspective gained from life experiences, so that you've had both positive, probably, and negative life experiences. You have a way to compare, so that gives you some perspective. And stability, job, housing, friends, and affiliations. The idea of friends and affiliations is going to come through this all the time. And the other thing about us adults is that hopefully you have a concern about future generations. and you then are able to focus on the needs of others. Peculiarly, one of the best resilient factors is, do you do something for somebody else? So, for example, when I was in Chicago and we had a psychiatric unit at Northwestern, the children, who all viewed themselves as being incredibly unfortunate and that nobody was in worse shape than they were, which actually wasn't true, but that's how they viewed it, they all volunteered at a home for cognitively impaired older adults. And actually it was a uniformly positive activity. These kids who would normally, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go book on their own and join whatever street crowd there is, they never ran from that activity. They went, they reliably participated, they came back. May have run the next day, but they didn't. They found the activity to be very important in giving them some sense that maybe there is a future for them. So you can become stronger with practice. Now, adversity is not desired, but it is part of all of us. So each event that you handle will build resilience. Importantly, those kids who are indulged, who get everything that they wish, the kind of eggs that grow up in little boxes, they don't develop resilience. They have a very difficult time managing adversity, and they expect things to be done for them rather than do things for themselves. That's not resilience. You have to learn over time. Really, you've got to do stuff for yourself. So, Buddhism describes the first noble truth of Buddhism is that all life involves suffering. Now, I would that would not be true, but somehow it is. So things will happen, so they need to be faced. The death of a parent or a spouse. Grief cannot really be controlled. It has to be accepted, and it has to run its course. So we're wired both for connection, which is inevitable. That's bonding and attachment in terms of human development. Bonding is the special relationship between a baby and the mother. Attachment occurs through the life cycle. You evolve relationships with people over time. Some of them are good, some of them are not so hot, but we're wired for connection. We're also wired for loss, since it's inevitable. What's inevitable? Death and taxes. So we are wired to manage loss. I've included death of a child because I think that's kind of special. Death of a child, I think, is very difficult in terms of mourning, as opposed to death of parent or spouse. In Western culture, emphasize Western culture, autonomy and being on your own is the end stage of development. In Eastern culture, not so much, role in the family. But in Western culture, being autonomous. And so if you're having a successful spousal relationship or special relationship with your parent, you've developed the ability to be by yourself first. So you've developed the ability to be independent by yourself first. So therefore you have something to come back to, your individual experience of competence, being independent, and able to manage on your own. It needs to be rebuilt, but it does exist. However, for the death of a child, I think it's different. For a parent who loses a child, they're losing a part of themselves. And so I think there's kind of always a hole there, because I think, speaking for myself, I don't know that I would like to believe that my children are now independent of me, that their well-being is dependent upon their successes and their spousal relationships. For me, my well-being is still dependent upon their successes. If they are not successful, I am miserable. And I remember, actually this occurred in Chicago, my daughter must have been about 3, and we were in a car with 3 other brats. And Pamela said, "They're not talking to me." I was just beside myself. I could have killed all of them. But of course I didn't, and she had to learn to develop herself. But it still is that way. If something is wrong, if she's troubled by something, it troubles me. There's no two ways about it. The same is true for my son. And then there are the inevitable life cycle things, concerns about retirement, which I am trying to avoid, and divorce, which again is a coming apart. It's probably all too common. Divorce, by the way, as an aside, is that something that parents do for themselves. Divorce for children is a nightmare because they don't learn that conflicts can be resolved. They just think relationships are replaceable. And children need to learn, as learning about resilience, that yeah, you have a conflict, you have a disagreement, but they need to be resolved. By the way, for those of you who read fairy tales, the real ones are really violent. But the end of all fairy tales is good conquers evil, and all the conflicts are resolved. And that's why kids can read scary stories, because you can resolve, the conflict has to be resolved. So it is likely that something problematic will happen at some time. So resilient strategies include experiencing your own strengths, appreciating the roles of others, form and develop deeper relationships, discover the meaning of life for you, which I'll get to in a moment for myself, and see new possibilities. So we learn more from failures than from successes. We learn more from bigger failures because we scrutinize them more closely. Strengthening resilience, being optimistic, not feeling defeated. When others see problems, the resilient person sees solutions, although they will acknowledge that the solutions are difficult. Partially, this is temperament, genetic and innate. By the way, in seeing solutions, you're generating hypotheses. You don't have to have a solution, you have to have an idea that you can put into practice. This influences relationships, meaning your temperament. So you try to surround yourself, if you can, with optimistic and hopeful people. When you stop and think about it, the core thing that psychotherapy does for patients provides hope. And so if you can surround yourself with hopeful people, it's catching, it's contagious. Hope is contagious, feelings are contagious, which is why watching a movie in the movie theater that's funny is funnier than it is when you watch it on Netflix, because affects and feelings are contagious. However, optimism needs to be realistic, focused upon recovery, even though difficult, and realizing that it will be a challenge. I want to talk about this just a little bit. I'm going to use recovery from alcoholism as a model. And when the 12-step programs were developed, they talk about recovery. Well, what are you recovering? It takes a while to become an alcoholic, good 15 years. And in that time, prior to really getting in trouble, you've married perhaps, had a career perhaps, had some children, and the alcoholism ruins that. However, once you stop drinking and develop strategies to manage it, then you recover what you had. You recover your positive identity, work, you recover your children if you're lucky, and your families and your career. So alcoholism is only part of your life. Admittedly, it took it over, but there was lots of other stuff that you had first. So part of being resilient is being able to recover what you have lost through the adversity. It's a challenge, but it's important. The other thing that's important here, and is important for kids, is that if you do one thing that's really difficult, you will be able to do other things that's really difficult. I don't know if any of you have children or grandchildren that have gone to Youth Challenge. Youth Challenge is a program run by the National Guard. It's a national program. It's a wilderness program. It takes kids who have failed in one way or another. school, drugs, delinquency, and it puts them in boot camp. And it is tough. And if they run the mark and are able to manage the experience of the boot camp, it is from there that all blessings flow. They've done one difficult thing, which gives them the idea that they can do multiple difficult things, and from there they can begin to meet challenges that life places upon them. So techniques. The problem isn't permanent, so rewrite the narrative of your life. So for example, my wife and I developed cancer in the same year, 1990. She developed, she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer on Mother's Day of 1990. And in the winter of 1990, in December, I was walking down Lakeshore Drive, and it was icy. And some crackhead ran into me with a motorbike. And I was brought to Northwestern, and it turned out, when they did all of the studies, that I had renal cell carcinoma. So I then woke up, I think 18 hours later, with a radical nephrectomy. And it was a life-changing event. It was that we really had to rewrite the narrative of our lives. The children were 8 months and 3 years at that point in time. And it had always been a childhood fantasy of mine to actually be here, to be a pediatrician on the beach in Hawaii. And the tradition in Judaism for observant folk, which I am sort of, my wife was more observant, is you rename yourself and move to escape the angel of death. So we decided to move here. Alice wanted to get away from the idea that everyone would feel sorry for her and for the children. She wanted them to grow up in an environment where the children to grow up in an environment where people were not focused upon her illness so that they were not treated like eggs. So she rewrote that narrative. She, by the way, didn't care one iota about me at that point. All she really cared about was that the children would be content and happy, and I was a vehicle to help that. I was the financial vehicle around that. I had a little bit of a different experience. In Chicago, I had a reasonably successful practice, but it was for the wealthy. I had a very high-end, upper middle class practice, the ideal that my residents would like to have, I'm sure. However, I found that in the circumstances to be kind of sterile. One, I was trained as an analyst, which means you've got to pay attention, but it can get awfully boring. And I found that when I was seeing patients, my thoughts were turning towards the problems of my children and myself, so therefore I couldn't be a particularly good analyst. I could sit and talk to people face to face, but not from the couch. Also, I took a look at my practice. Well, anybody can do what I was doing. I mean, anybody reasonably well trained can see motivated people and help them get better. So when I came here, I focused, and my entire practice here has been focused on partially training and partially on the public sector, the care of people that other people just either can't be bothered with or reject, and a huge amount of advocacy. So again, I had to use my skill, which admittedly was my degree, but then I had to take a shift in how I viewed using that skill to what would give my life more meaning. It also, by the way, I have a kind of very Old Testament belief in God. I believe in a kind of a nasty Old Testament God. But the idea is, if you take care of God, God takes care of you. So I believed that by focusing on the public sector, which is much of what we do on inpatient psychiatry here at Queens, and certainly on the FTC, then I am taking care of God's people, and then God will take care of me. So it's been a reasonably good run for me, not so much for my wife. But again, the idea is that the problem isn't permanent. You've got to focus on doing stuff for others and what others can do for you, and rewrite the narrative of your life so you can cope with a life-changing stress. Don't personalize it. There's almost no failure which is totally personal. So, for example, when Alice got ill, it was in the era when we were thinking about how diet related to breast cancer. And her mother was still alive, and all Sylvia could talk about, you ate badly, you had all that rich food. If you hadn't done that, you wouldn't have breast cancer. That's ridiculous. But it's common. Children who have diabetes blame themselves for eating too much sugar. And when something goes wrong, we tend to, well, we should have done it differently. The wouldas and shouldas. We focus on what should have been done differently. However, all problems have multiple factors. So we have to do a resilient factors to do a realistic appraisal. What are the things that perhaps you could have done differently? But then what are the things that other people did that caused difficulties so you could manage those things? Then the other issue is permanence. One of the things that happens both with stress and depression is how we feel now is how we always felt and how we always will feel. You're a prisoner of the present. So at times of managing a highly stressful situation, you focus on, it's always going to be this way. This happened, I can't change it. We tend to ruminate, and admittedly, I do ruminate at times when something goes wrong, but you have to move past it. The past can't be changed, so you have to focus upon changing the present. This then gives you a future. So what can you do in the present that will help you have a future? The other thing that's important is whatever problem you're facing, it's not pervasive. This event will not affect all areas of your life. If you have to face a divorce, job change, then if you've developed resilient strategies over time, you have friends, family, interests, things that you're doing that are running in parallel with the problem, so that you have enough other things to manage and organize your life in the present. And rather than focus on how others have coped, focus on your own successes. Accomplishing one difficult task means that you can do it again. And for many of us, part of growing up is managing a bully. Probably every one of us have had a painful breakup in adolescence. There's nothing more painful than an adolescent relationship gone wrong. Managing a problem such as alcohol use or substance use. A challenge at work or school, an athletic challenge. All of these things, as individual events, may seem not so much, but in the aggregate, they develop resilience. That is, so part of the importance of resilience is kind of preventing illness, preventing depression. It's a preventive strategy. And so all of these things add up to a resilient lifestyle. So then there's the role of others. You need to develop a strong network of friends and family. And helping others will enhance resilience, which I really can't emphasize enough. The role of volunteerism, the role of religious affiliations, the role of doing something for somebody else, charitable stuff, will enhance your resilience. And rather than blaming others, you have to take responsibility for yourself and your life. It's an easy thing to say. We all say that we're going to do it, but how many of us essentially blame others for our difficulties? And the other resilient factor is don't be afraid to directly address problems with yourself as well as with others. For example, in talking to adolescents, and if you're concerned about suicide, the fear is if you mention suicide, it'll suggest that they'll do it. You'll give them the idea. It's the reverse, actually. If they're thinking about suicide and you don't talk about it, they will think you don't care. Silence is consent. And in terms of friends who are facing illness, Now, granted, people are entitled to privacy, but at times we treat people with illness as if they're eggs and that they're going to break, and that they welcome the opportunity to talk about what's happened, how they feel, changes, things like that, and what you can do, if anything, to help. You can't change the illness factor, but you can make things easier. Don't be afraid to directly address problems about yourself. Otherwise, that again is a problem, because the problems will fester. Take stress breaks. Remember, resilience is cumulative. Stress is inevitable. Now, so you can do it a couple of ways. You can take stress breaks, doing things regularly. That's kind of exercise, meditation, power naps, stuff like that. But most importantly, you should have fun. Have fun safely, sleep hygiene, take regular breaks, lunch with friends, but don't talk about work. And then the role of intimate relationships. So again, all of these things build resilience. Challenge yourself. The worst part of my growing up was going to a prep school and having to run 5 miles every morning. I am not an athlete. It was horrible. But I wouldn't let them beat me. So I had to complete the run every morning. I was ready to die. But it did build the idea that it was admittedly a challenge for me. You can't tell from behind the podium, but I have actually short little legs. So I'm not well proportioned. And so it was a real challenge. But it was something that I wanted to do because I wasn't going to allow people to think that I couldn't. And so you do have to challenge yourself. So, and importantly, psychiatric illness and anxiety has a triggering phenomenon. The more you feel anxiety, the more likely you are to feel anxiety. The more you feel anxiety, the more likely you are to feel anxiety for ever simpler things. Same is true with depression. You have the first episode of depression. If you manage it well, that's fine, but as the successive episodes go on, then you're going to feel depressed at ever increasing intervals and for much easier things. So as you handle stress better, your anxiety will diminish and it will attenuate your response so that things that would have previously caused you anxiety no longer do. By the way, the only reason I had to stop running is I made the mistake of falling off a treadmill, the treadmill of death. So that then meant that I could finally give it up. And I was so pleased. I'm going to talk about developing resilience in children because it is important. And as I go through this, you'll see that some of the things are written in red because they are relevant for adults as well. So I don't remember, I remember the title, but I don't remember what it was. Everything you needed to know you learned in kindergarten. And this has that kind of quality, that if you're lucky enough to grow up in an environment where stress is graded, where positive things are reinforced, where you're not criticized, but you're told, okay, you did a good job, but let's look at what happened here and let's see what we can do differently, you are going to develop a little bit more strongly. So the 7 C's: competence, confidence, connection, contribution, coping strategies, control, and character. Since we change throughout the life cycle, these same principles are for adults as well. Admittedly, responsibility changes. In childhood, parents are supposed to help the kids with it. In adulthood, you're supposed to help yourself with it. In older adulthood, your kids help the parents with it. So it comes through the life, so it is a life cycle sort of thing. So competence, basically it's an ability rooted in experience. And children acquire competence by mastering tasks and facing challenges. This is true for all of us. That is, in order to experience competence, you have to have an experience, you have to master a task, and we are all mastering different tasks. Right now, I am mastering how I am not going to retire. But I spent a lot of time mastering cooking, which was quite good, which is what I used to replace running. Competence is cumulative. That is, it does add. It does add up. The more children master life experiences, the more they realize they can tackle challenges. As they tackle challenges, they develop confidence. And with competence comes tenacity and the ability to complete tasks despite adversity. And this becomes important in school. I remember coming home and seeing my daughter in tears about a math problem. So she had enough. Okay, Pamela, we're going to need to deal with this. You go get yourself something to eat. I will take a look at it and we'll see if we can figure it out. It took us an hour and a half to figure out this math problem. But we did, and we completed the task. We have to help the child focus on the strengths and build upon them. Notice what we do well rather than focus on mistakes. And if a child makes a mistake, recognize the mistake, but acknowledge that mistakes are not pervasive. Describe strengths at the same time, the so-called feedback sandwich. A patient taught me about this. We were doing a group, and she suggested we give one another feedback. And she then said, well, we need to use a feedback sandwich, something that she had learned somewhere else. And she then said, good, bad, good. So when you give feedback, you say something that's good, you then give what the problem is, and then end with something that's good. If you help the child recognize their strengths, and social and stress reduction skills. And again, these skills are necessary in childhood as they are in adulthood. Encourage the child to make their own decisions, facilitate thinking rather than lecture. This is my failing. I tend at times to lecture. And allow a certain number of mistakes so that the child learns to correct them and feel safe. And different children have different strengths. The same is true. Resilience strategies for all of us are different because there are different things that we do well. Confidence is the belief in one's own abilities, and we need to focus on fairness, integrity, persistence, kindness, rather than achievement. And give praise, but it has to be praise for something that's genuine, and that would be experienced as something that's worthy. Giving praise for something that the child doesn't experience as worthy is kind of empty. The same is true for adults. Giving praise for something that they think is not going to go anywhere because it's just empty. For confidence, you have to expectations have to be realistic versus exceptionally high expectations. So we all have to be aware of what we can handle and what the child can realistically handle, and it's very different. So again, using my running example, the people at school decided that I could run 5 miles in the morning. I didn't want to, but they were right, I could do it. So it was a realistic expectation. Therefore, I grow by doing it. However, there will be other people who can't do that, and so that really should be avoided. That's a real problem in education, by the way, especially in large classes. It is really hard for kids if the school is unaware of their expectations or their abilities, and then they're asked to do what they cannot do. That creates a considerable amount of anxiety, turmoil, and in school settings, violence. Because the quickest way to get out of a classroom is to be aggressive, and you're sent to the principal's office. So you don't have to be ashamed or embarrassed because you've done something cool. but you haven't. So that realistic is important, and knowing what the abilities are. And again, we have in the islands, as well as I grew up, in a shame-based culture that is not good for resilience. So we really need to avoid creating shame. We do it to one another, and we do it to our kids. And that is a real problem, because if you're feeling ashamed, you're not going to say or do much. Close ties to family, friends, school, and community, and give the children a solid sense of security. There also has to be knowledge of belonging to a wider world. This is one of the advantages of religion, culture, for part Hawaiian, being aware of your genealogy, being aware of your language and things like that. For any of the cultures that you realize you're part of a family and part of a wider world. And there's got to be a certain amount of challenge. And do we focus upon resolving conflict and directly solve problems rather than allow them to fester? This is a very big deal. If within families and within marriages and within relationships, if problems and conflict fester, it interferes with relationships, and you don't learn the techniques that are necessary to manage relationships. In families, shared entertainment time, I never, until they were very much older, I never allowed computers in their rooms. They had to be in one place so I could see what they were doing. And we never watched television, but there were identified times when we always did stuff as a family. Mostly dinner, actually. And they need to take pride in the activities that the parents do and that they do, and again, healthy relationships. Character is basically knowing what's right and wrong, and if they have their own values, they can stick up for themselves. I remember being on a television panel with a group of teenagers, and the discussion was peer pressure. And the moderator asked about peer pressure, and these kids said, no, I do what I think is right for me, and I have some idea of what I'm supposed to do. So if kids can develop that, and if we help them develop that, then they can stick up for themselves and their own values. They also need to learn to care for others. Again, you can see the themes are highly repetitive, but how you do it has to be individual to you in terms of what works for you. Contributing to the community and serving others. Children can learn to improve their community and create specific opportunities for themselves through volunteer work, through voter drives, things like that. My son actually, when he was in high school, led a voter drive to get 18-year-olds registered. So there are things that you can learn to do that are helpful. Coping strategies. Coping strategies are not distraction. Many people talk about coping strategies as listening to music, running, a variety of techniques to help manage tension, which do indeed work and they are important at the moment. But genuine coping strategies are those things that you do that resolve conflicts and make change, rather than kind of distracting yourself from the feeling. Control. When children realize that they can control the outcomes of their decisions and actions, they are more likely to know that they have the ability to bounce back from problems. If we make all the decisions, they're denied the opportunities to learn control. We have to allow them to fail at times and then discover that they can right their own wrongs. They're not necessarily responsible for all that's bad. The same as I said earlier, when something problematic happens, the causes are multifactorial. We can't control all the circumstances, but we can control some. And by controlling some, we improve the odds for positive behaviors. So, This is gonna sound like what I learned in kindergarten. Children need to experience competence to gain confidence. They need connections with an adult to reinforce competence. They need character to know what they should contribute to their families and the world. Character is built through connections to others. Contribution to the community builds character and further strengthens connections. Children who contribute to their communities gain confidence as they feel more and more competent. This then helps them realize that they can make a difference and change their environment, and it gives them a sense of control. Children with a sense of control believe that they can solve problems. Solving problems then reinforces competence and confidence. When children know that they can control their environment, they are more likely to use healthy coping strategies. They don't need to deaden their senses to escape reality. And the key coping strategy is turning to people with whom they have a strong connection. I don't think there's any difference between children and adults in this situation. It's kind of a pathway to manage problems in life. And in summary, for an adult, there are the 4 Ps that I said earlier. Don't personalize, realize that it's not permanent, it's not pervasive, and practice optimism. And in summary, find a sense of purpose in your life, build positive beliefs in your abilities, develop a strong social network. Change is not bad, embrace it. Take care of yourself, that means be healthy. Develop problem-solving skills and establish goals which change throughout the life cycle. I hope this has been helpful. I want to make a couple of comments. I appreciate everybody coming. Mental health actually is a very big deal. About more than 60% of the healthcare dollar is spent on the consequences of life cycle stuff. Depression, anxiety, smoking, obesity, hypertension, and it's not on the dramatic stuff like heart disease. Queens there's been mental health at Queens since its inception in 1859. So there has always been mental health and psychiatry at the medical center. We offer a full range of services, and the counseling center does offer both all the expected therapies, individual, family, group, but they also have groups on anger management, anxiety, and issues that we all face: grief and loss, cancer and recovery, relationships, depression and anxieties, caregiver burnout. So managing all of these inevitable life problems are things that the counseling service does handle. We have groups for, and should it be necessary, I would hope you could call them and set up some time. I hope this has been helpful, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I ended on time this year. Last year I did not.
Okay, we have a question here in the...
Hello, is there any books you recommend?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Option B for adult resilience, and for childhood resilience, it's one of the advantages of phones. I can look it up on I have Kindle, I have it on my phone. If I can find the app. Option B for adult resilience, building resilience in children and teens.
Any other questions? Raise your hand.
Well,
You must have answered them all.
Well, either that or I was incredibly dull and put you all to sleep. So if you have any concerns or questions, by all means, for those of you who signed up online, email Lisa and she'll kind of try to dole them out to the right people.
Thank you, Dr. Carlton. I also want to say mahalo to Angela Macera, Ken Hansen, and Don Seto. They were the people out there in the lobby. They're from Queens Behavioral Health, and so you were able to pick up information. They made the copies of his PowerPoint this evening, so let's give them a round of applause. And also want to say mahalo to our Queens volunteers this evening, Karen Sumida, Laura Nagasawa, and Anthony Chen, who shared their Wednesday checking all of you guys in tonight. And I want to say this is our last Queens Speaking of Health of the year. So we know that toward the end of December it gets very busy and you're shopping. So we realize that. So our next one's going to come up in January. So January 31st, after you've eaten all the turkey and the, all the wonderful things, we're going to have something called Psychology of Eating. Perfect timing, isn't it? Just when you're starting to feel bad about yourself. We're going to have Dr. Ronnie Sato of the Comprehensive Weight Management Program. She's going to be talking about those kinds of things. A registered dietitian, Connie Wang, is going to talk about things like physical versus mental hunger. They're going to cover strategies on bringing intention to your eating habits. There's also going to be information from a behavioral health specialist, Lori Kunihara, and that's going to be January 31st. We don't have it posted online yet. We're still working on it, so check back at queens.org, attend a class in December, and we'll have that all posted for you. You can also call the Queens referral line at 691-7117. So for this year, that's going to do it for us. I want to wish you Happy Thanksgiving, let's see, Happy Kwanzaa, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year until January. And during this time, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be connecting with family and friends. Perfect time to build those strong networks that he was talking about. So we'll be mindful of that as we head into the holiday season, to make friends and to also to build those relationships, because that's going to be what helps us build resilience in 2018. I wish all the best for you in 2018 and for the rest of this year. Have a good evening. Don't forget your evaluations, turn it out there, and then drive safe and have a good night.